Good afternoon. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We're a 34-year-old free market think tank based in Dallas, Texas. I'd like to welcome you all today to our Zoom briefing on the role of government in the broadband expansion. We appreciate you all being here with us. We especially thank those of you who are donors and financial supporters of IPI for making these events possible. Thank you very much. If anyone out there would like to become a supporter or a member of IPI, please feel free to contact Addie Crimmins. Her email address is in all of the email communications that you got regarding this event. So Addie would be delighted to talk to you about how you can get involved with IPI. I'm going to get out of the way and I'm going to turn things over to Bartlett Cleland. Bartlett is a research fellow here at IPI, and among many other roles that he plays in the technology policy world, he's been with IPI for a very long time. We've always valued our relationship with Bartlett, and we appreciate him putting this event together for us today. So with that, Bartlett, I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome, everyone. Happy you could join us today. We have a great panel, and we're going to be discussing broadband expansion across the country and what is the government's role. We're going to have time later for your questions, and Tom told you how to submit those, so be getting them ready. We'll probably take about 35, 40, 45 minutes for us, and then the rest of the time will be yours and for the panel to respond. So with that, let me introduce our panel. I've got to say, chock full of friends, some very long time and some new, but chock full of friends, just the way I love doing panels. So first of all, from me to you guys, thank you personally. And then from IPI to you guys, thank you from IPI. And I'm sure the audience will be thankful by the time we're finished. So first, Andrea Castillo O'Sullivan is the director of the Center for Technology and Innovation at the James Madison Institute, where she thinks about ways to make the state of Florida the best place to live and to build. Her research and outreach on topics like cryptocurrency, telecommunications, data policy, and internet infrastructure helps to inform policymakers about how to encourage growth and development in all areas of innovation. And I also have to mention, she just pulled off a fantastic event. I think that was last week. I'm already losing track of my days. That happened exactly in the middle of the Cuba protests, or the protests against the Cuban government. So it was an exciting time to be in Tampa. I was blessed to be asked to speak there. So thank you, Andrea. But if you're not following her, you're not following JMI, you should. Next up, we have Michael O'Reilly, former FCC commissioner and now principal at MPORielly Consulting. Mike, as he says, is a recovering government staffer directly embracing entrepreneurialism in the marketplace by offering advice and suggestions to select clients while being told what to do by his two very young daughters without having any experience in raising very young daughters. Sounds stunningly like my life, Mike. I love it. Next, we have Jeff Westling. He's Technology and Innovation Policy Fellow at R Street. He leads R Street's work on telecommunications policy, advocating for a market-based approach and deployment and spectrum policy. He is also R Street's representative on the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, and their annual Broadband Scorecard project aims to reduce local barriers to broadband deployment. He has already been, you can still tell if you just give him a quick look, he still looks a little down right now. He was all but weeping earlier. He's an avid Suns fan and is in mourning. So he will do his best to be uplifting today about broadband, even if not about the Suns. Thank you, Jeff. And we have Marc Paul, Vice President in Vice President of Policy and External Affairs at Charter Communications. In this role, he is responsible for identifying, developing, and shaping the company's position on industry policy matters and assessing key internet, video, technology, and communications industry trends. During his career, he has held positions as legal advisor to a commissioner at the FCC, as senior counsel to a U.S. senator, pardon me, and a position of counsel for two private law firms. He holds a law degree from University of Pennsylvania Law School and a BA from Cornell. It's too bad he's not better educated, but we have him here anyway. Thank you for joining us, Marc. All right, so let's get right to it so we can maximize the time from this great group of experts here. expanding affordable high-speed internet access seems to have emerged as a key priority in the states and localities in 2021, and is certainly getting a lot of attention in Washington, D.C., even if the focus is kind of those states and localities. The driving factors for many include things like education and healthcare, but without a doubt, there's entertainment, there's looking for jobs, etc. All of this was put on steroids or high alert, whatever analogy you hope to use during the pandemic. With approximately 4% of the country, and that's true in almost every state. I happen to know that's true in Florida because we just talked about it. It is also true in Texas, for example, but it's generally true across the country. With approximately 4% of the country without access to broadband and Congress spending billions of dollars on broadband, the question is, what is needed to continue the expansion, and what role will or should the government be playing? Folks, if I could get a very pithy 2 minutes or so from each of you as an overview, that would be great. And Mike, you're in the top box right next to me, at least on my screen. So you are the winner. You can go first.
All right, pithy, okay, all right. So I do believe there is a role, and have been active and engaged in broadband policy for quite a while. I think there's a role for the government to incentivize private sector build out to reach to those consumers, those Americans who do not have broadband today, and to address the affordability issue of the cost of broadband. There's a school of thought that the government should not be involved, but it actually has been involved from the early 1900s. And so I think this is an extension of that, and is smart policy, and is something that should be continued in a thoughtful way.
Wow, that is pithy. I love it. You win. Oh wait, other competitors. Andrea, next up to bat.
I don't know if I can be quite that pithy, but I'll try. So thanks for having me today. So in terms of top level things that policymakers should consider, we're a state focused think tank. So as you mentioned, we're in Florida. So we're very fortunate. There's a pretty good policy environment there, but we mostly focus on what state policymakers can do. We obviously benefit from good FCC leadership, like the former commissioner, right, making it easier for us to do what we need to do in the state level, but we can't control that. So a couple of things that state policymakers could do, and there's two general messages I have. First, how can we look at ways to make it easier to build out, right? What kinds of policies are in place that prevent that? Sometimes that's literally a government policy. Sometimes that's just a norm that's developed in terms of the way that things like pole attachments are regulated, or the way that these agreements work between parties, who's going to pay for what kind of taxation is associated with these attachments. So that's one thing that policymakers should look at. The second thing they should look at is just making better use of the funds that are available. So states get a lot of money from the federal government, and that can be spent in better or worse ways. So just something as simple as taking account of what money you get from the federal government, how that's being distributed, what are the effects of that, and can that be made more efficient? So those are things that state policymakers across the country can do right now, regardless of the moves that are being made on the federal level.
Thank you very much. That was pretty pithy. Good job. All right, Marc, you're next in the hot seat.
I'm never pithy, so I'm very worried. I'm very worried. Well, look, I agree with everything that's been said so far, but first want to actually start by just saying thank you to IPI for having me today. It's great to join the others on this panel. It's a great panel. Real quick, I just wanted to say one thing about Charter. There's some people out there that might not be familiar with our company, just so you have some context of what we do. We're a broadband connectivity company and cable operator serving more than 31 million customers in 41 states under a brand name Spectrum, which you may be more familiar with. And we offer a full range of services: internet, TV, mobile, and voice services. I mention all of that not as an advertisement, but just to give you some context that we are in the nitty-gritty of building out broadband networks. That's what we do. So we have some experience here. And in fact, we've invested nearly $40 billion in infrastructure and technology over the last 5 years, and that's enabled us to connect more than 2.5 million homes and businesses and so forth over the last few years. We, as a company, are committed to closing this technology divide that everybody's always talking about. And people often talk about access gaps and adoption gaps. And we as a company want to be part of the solution. And, specifically to the point about the role of government, we recognize as a company that there are some access, and that's really when we talk about access, we talk about, is a service even available to you? And then we're talking about adoption gaps, which are maybe it's just not affordable for a low-income family to get the service. We realize that there are some gaps we can do a lot to help reduce, but then there are some that probably the government does have a role to play and can be helpful in closing those gaps and really narrowing them down. And, that role, which obviously we're going to talk more about today, I think if people leave today with only remembering one thing that I say, to me, I think, and for Charter, that role needs to be a very targeted role and a very thoughtful role for government. And in particular, it shouldn't ignore all the success and the investment that has been made already in broadband deployment in the country. It can't ignore that, but needs to build upon that and look for those places that only the government uniquely can play a role. And usually that is providing assistance where a build of a broadband network just wouldn't be economical otherwise. So I'll leave it there. Not very pithy, but I tried.
You did all right. And now we know your one thing. That was great. All right, Jeff, why don't you bring us home in this opening part of our day?
Sure, and thanks for having me. I won't repeat kind of what everyone said. I agree basically with everything that's been said so far. So, it's obviously a great place to start. But the one thing I want to highlight for sure is just that this is, infrastructure. This is really important to make sure that we get Americans connected to broadband. Government's role here, as Mike was saying, is to be focused on promoting that free market and promoting those innovations that we've seen from the private investment. And broadband is, one of those things that constantly needs more investment. And a lot of the free market policies that the FCC and state legislatures have been pushing forward in recent years have really shown some results. And we've seen that through the pandemic, and we've seen our networks hold up really well. And it's really important to just kind of keep moving forward with what we've been doing because it's been working. And I think one of the areas that we'll get into a little bit later, so I'll try to be pithy here, is just that there's a lot of different technologies now that are starting to enter the market and compete with one another in different and exciting ways. And a lot of those technologies are still in their infancy. So if you have a market-driven approach, you can see things like WIFs or satellite really start to lower the cost of deployment and lower the barriers that they've been facing in the past. And who knows where that things will be in 10, 15, 20 years. So it's just exciting to see kind of where the market might drive some of these innovations.
A really good point, and one that is often not made, and I'm going to learn from your example. Some of this is about the excitement of what the market can bring that we can't even imagine, and that's a kind of a cool thing, I think, particularly in days where you're trapped in your house and doesn't feel like anything is going on. It's pretty cool to see some new innovations. All right, so let's get into what's going on right now. A whole lot of money, Mike and I were talking about this before the call started, floating around out there in the world across various government projects, including what's called RDOF. You might hear people refer to that here. That's the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. There is somewhere around $109 billion, almost $110 billion floating around for various broadband projects right now, already out the door. That's before we talk about any kind of infrastructure debate or any new spending that might happen there. So, and likely more will come in that package one way or another. So Mike, let's go to you. Let's talk about that infrastructure proposal for a minute and where broadband's concerned. And is the infrastructure spending bill contemplating, is the one that we have seen even up to yesterday, I think we had a draft leaked, is it contemplating a proper use of government? And is there a likelihood that government intervention could get, a little too heavy-handed, be a little too significant?
Well, I think what I've seen so far, I've been pleasantly surprised that the conversation has moved away from some what I would call the wish list of some of the progressives in the early days of the Biden administration. We've moved away from some terrible policies I believe at least in terms of the last draft that I reviewed, things like artificial speed limits and symmetrical speeds and municipal priorities and overbuilding and rate regulation and maybe even a low-cost tier mandates, things like that seem to be moving in the right direction, away from bad policies. And to me, that's really important. Things like municipal ownership, really problematic, incredibly detrimental to the goal of building up broadband to those Americans who need it by the private sector. And so I think that the bill is moving in the right direction. There are still some things that could be added, that would make it better. I think Andrea mentioned two areas that I would always favor. One is dealing directly with the barriers to deployment, and I don't think that that's probably going to be addressed. If I were a betting man on this conversation, I've weighed in and testified, but I don't see that being the case. And then that's the a proper or accounting use of funds, and I do worry that the money is a little bit free flowing and how it's been provided to the agencies. I'd like to see greater control, so we make sure that we get the bang for the buck for the taxpayer dollars.
Now, I know I didn't mention this to you earlier, but I'm actually just kind of curious on your last comment. When you were sitting in the commissioner's seat, was it more helpful to you to get those kind of directions directly from the legislators, or were you was it more of a hindrance? Were you like, yeah, let me do this as I want to? What kind of worked better?
Now, if you go back and look at any speech I gave, I actually favored any time that the Congress or whatever the situation may be, where they provided specific instructions on how they wanted the program to go or how they wanted the policy to be drafted. I think that's beneficial. The more leeway you give to an agency, they're going to go in different directions. And if you see some of our programs on USF, the FCC's programs on USF, they've had difficulties. And some of those are because the statute is very broad. And that leads to fraud, waste, and abuse, and it's problematic. So I always appreciated when it was as specific as possible and told me what to do and then absolutely what not to do.
Very cool. Well, Jeff, that actually leads right into something I wanted to chat with you about. So attaching strings to money is not an uncommon action or reaction by government at all. We've certainly heard a fair amount in Washington and in the States about what they call symmetrical speeds. So 100 up, 100 down, 100 megabits up, 100 down. So symmetrical, up and down, same speed. So as you send stuff out to the internet or receive stuff back from the internet, it's coming at the same speed. And there's been some attempt or discussion about tying funding to meeting those speeds. So first of all, what do you think the impact of these kind of calls for this definition of broadband? What will be the effect in the marketplace and on providers?
Well, sure. I think it's first important to distinguish. There's two kind of separate calls here. One is redefining broadband, generally speaking, as 100, and the other is tying future subsidies to building out networks that meet that speed. And they're important to distinguish because the first is generally used to target areas. If a location doesn't have 100 and you define broadband as 100, then they would be eligible for subsidies under programs like RDOF or the new infrastructure package, whenever that kind of gets moved through. And that would be really detrimental. That's something that's really problematic because we have a lot of areas in the country that just don't have any connection right now. They don't have the 25.3, which is the current standard. And I think a Deloitte report came out earlier this year that was showing just how much more important it is to get folks connected to that first level of internet rather than trying to increase speeds by X amount, because that first getting connected is really the most important part. And that's what we need to be focusing our funds on. So some of the talk at the beginning kind of hinted at maybe redefining broadband, but I think now it's shifted more towards the latter, which is tying the subsidies to at 100. And what that essentially is saying is that they want fiber. The folks who want the subsidy programs, they want fiber optic cable to go everywhere. And it's understandable because right now fiber is, really probably the best technology, but it's not universal. It's not always the best technology. There's a lot of communities that are going to have different needs. They're not always going to have the same requirements as other communities. And for a lot of these places, maybe the existing cable provider would be much cheaper, much easier to build out the existing network that's there. It might be easier to have a WISP come in. It might be easier to have satellite internet options that are available, which would cost a lot less money and provide that initial service and get those folks connected without worrying too much about the specific technology. And kind of tying it back to the point I made at the beginning is that we still have a lot of these technologies that have a lot of room for growth, and we don't necessarily want to pick one specific technology and just think, well, this is clear above the best technology right now, so it's always going to be that way. There's a lot of different needs, and it's important that we don't exclude that flexibility and basically decide for communities what the best technology for them would be. And that's kind of where I get worried about some of these ties and really trying to focus in solely on fiber. And it's just, the fact is the usage data doesn't match this requirement. I think it's like 14-to-1 right now in terms of how much traffic is downstream versus how much is upstream. And it's a little ridiculous to redefine broadband as 100-100 just as a means so you can select fiber. And if we really want to redefine broadband, I think Gus Hurwitz was talking about this, and Daniel Lyons as well, talking about what we need to do is figure out what people actually need in terms of the services that we want broadband to support, and then define broadband based off that. Because it might be time to revisit the 25.3 standard, but I can almost guarantee you what people need is not going to be that 100 megabits per second upload, download, symmetrical speed. So it's just one of those things that is very problematic to me as somebody who likes to let the market drive what folks actually need.
So a couple of terms in there. I just want to make sure everyone is with us. So essentially what you're saying is that right now the typical usage case is that I'm downloading a lot more data, let's say movies, just to pick something that's a heavy use, or games, as opposed to what I'm sending, which tends to be more things like pictures of the kids or email, etc. I have that right? All right. And then secondly, you mentioned a WISP. Can you tell everybody what a WISP is? Yeah,
it's just a fixed wireless service provider. Basically, it's similar to any other broadband provider, but they use a spectrum to send the signal out, and rather than a fiber optic cable or a cable network. So it's just a different means of providing broadband to consumers.
Cool, a different technology. In other words. So, and I guess then my last thing to make sure that I understand everything you said. So while they haven't defined, or they haven't stated a technology, while they're not planning to state a technology that needs to be used, they've essentially defined what could be used in such a way that it leads you to one technology, not a variety. Do I have that right?
That's what I believe, but I'm sure Marc might argue that the cable folks can hit that standard as well, but we'll see what he has to say. Great
tee up. I owe you $20 because I'm next going to Marc. Let's see, if we had more squares, I'd call you the center square, but you're not. So I know Charter is building out like crazy, Marc. In Florida, the whole central part of the state's getting built out by you guys under the RDOF program. I know Texas has gained from that, just a couple that I know of. But I mentioned this because some voices out there are making it sound like what is being built out already is not going to work in the future, as if this is going to be a complete waste. What's the story here? And to give the hint to everybody, it tees off of exactly what Jeff was just telling us.
Well, you won't be surprised to know that you shouldn't believe everything that you hear, Bartlett. We are. I really appreciate the question, actually, to talk about RDOF, although I do it with some trepidation, knowing that former Commissioner O'Reilly is here, who is very much involved in the RDOF program and is very familiar with it. But just for people listening out there that keep hearing this term, as Bartlett said, it's the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And I think it's a great, program to kind of talk a little bit about smart kind of government public-private partnerships, given, some of the elements of the program that really get to that targeted kind of focused, government involvement in broadband expansion that I hinted to earlier. But essentially the program is a two-phased program to put money out to expand rural broadband deployment in two phases. And the first phase, which has already been completed, focused on unserved census blocks, unserved being not served by 25.3 speeds. Very smart of the government to kind of focus on those areas with the idea that, look, those areas are uneconomical to serve. We're going to have to come in as a government, as a society, and say, let's provide some assistance to get the service there. But the government then took the step the next step of holding a reverse auction to decide where these funds should go, with the idea that the money should go to those who can do it the most cost efficient way, so that the government and the public gets the most bang for the buck. So, that focus on unserved areas, I think, is really important. And we shouldn't lose sight of that as we talk about infrastructure now, on Capitol Hill. But, I just want to emphasize what a smart role that is for government to play. But long and short of it is, Charter participated in this auction, won $1 billion in this phase one. But on top of that, Charter is putting in $4 billion of its own private capital. So essentially leveraging off of that money from the government, combining that with private capital. And because of that, we're going to be able to reach over the next several years what the FCC estimates to be 1 million unserved locations across 24 states. And it's something we're really proud of. But in direct answer to your question, when we deploy a network into these areas, because of the way that the RDOF program was established, we are going to be deploying fiber in these areas. Robust fiber network that's capable of 1 gig down, 500 up. We'll start speeds at 200 megabits down for folks. So we're not deploying a second-rate network in rural America or in these areas. In fact, we're doing just the opposite. We're deploying a robust network that's going to meet next generation demands for many, many years to come. And it's going to transform communities in the process. So I know that wasn't pithy yet again, but hopefully it gives you an overview of what we're doing.
Absolutely. And so exciting. I mean, I can remember for folks who are in Texas, this was years ago, but when I think I have all these facts right, in Keller, Texas, when AT&T first launched its new network, whichever one it was at that point, and people literally were jealous they weren't living in Keller, Texas. I imagine there's going to be some of that same reaction for some people in these rural areas. There will be this desire to be living in those areas or having industry in those areas. And I think of the benefits for farming and agriculture broadly, which are huge and hardly ever talked about. And in fact, we should have a whole call on that at some point. So we're talking hyper local. So let's stay local here for a little while. And Andrea, I want to come to you. So state policymakers who you mentioned in your tee-up, they are some of the people involved in what's going on in the state. Obviously, they're also regulators, but state policymakers and local policymakers very much involved. So when it comes to grants and funding, what should they be considering in their localities?
So I think there's two major areas, and that's first good governance, and then looking at incentives. So the very first step is to look at what you're actually spending money on, right? So the state of Florida is fairly good about this. We have an Office of Broadband that is explicitly tasked with both applying for and dispersing grants. We had recent legislation this past session that kind of beefed up and clarified the duties of this office and kicked up another effort for broadband mapping, right? So identifying the problem. But some states might not have a defined office to do that. They might have funding both being applied for and dispersed by many different groups, some of which might not even know what the other's doing or that they exist. So having one defined body that kind of owns that funding is probably the first part of it, because you need to know what you're actually doing to know how you can improve it, right? And the second part, so once you kind of have a handle on what's out there and how you're spending the money, I would encourage state and local policymakers to always be thinking about incentives. So the way that you design your grants can have a big impact on final effectiveness. And then obviously the goal is to get the broadband access. So, how many people can actually access it and how affordable it's going to be. So let me just start with maybe the very worst case scenario where you have a government just set up a public network that has, very little accountability to the public, very little incentive to provide the best services. That's obviously very poor incentive design, and those networks tend to be fairly poorly run and don't really improve access and are quite expensive. Or you can have a process where a grant is just kind of given to one company and there's not a lot of competition. There's not like a bidding kind of process. It's kind of a corporatist crony kind of handout, and that's obviously going to have bad incentives. Or ideally, you can try to recreate the market as much as you can, or get towards kind of market incentives. We have a recent paper by Brent Slorup and Michael Kotros of the Mercatus Center looking at how states can structure grant programs. They look specifically at the Universal Service Fund, which is a federal FCC program, but looking at how the states design them or disperse the money that they receive from that federal program. If you do more of like a consumer voucher style, right, where you're giving people money to maybe lower the cost of their own bill. If they're in an area that doesn't have a lot of broadband, maybe that'll induce more carriers to go there. But the power of the dollar is with the consumer rather than, a bureaucrat who, even though they might have the best of intentions, they just don't have that market knowledge. They don't have that tacit information about, as some of the other gentlemen have been talking, what the needs are and what needs to be served. So those are the two kind of major steps that state policymakers can take to really improve their funding process in their state.
Very good. So even with what you were saying, Andrea, and Jeff, I'm going to come to you. Government can clearly act in ways that scare off new investment just by creating uncertainty. They don't have to do much other than just create confusion and concern. So to what extent should local governments be getting involved in providing connectivity, that is to say, municipal broadband?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of concerns with municipalities getting involved in the broadband business. I think three that are kind of the main ones for me. The first just being the fact that it's going to drive off investment. You've got a subsidized competitor now that's coming in a lot of markets that already have a broadband provider or have a market case for additional build out. That's going to go away if there's a subsidized entrant. And we're going to talk a little bit about pole attachments later, but that's also another angle of this, where a lot of the rates for getting attachment to municipal poles and electric co-op poles, they cost a lot. And if now that all of a sudden is a competitor to the private industry, finding access to that infrastructure is always going to be tricky. The second is, there's a lot of lack of expertise among these localities. They don't really know how to run a broadband network. It's difficult. This is not an easy business, and the companies have that expertise. They have that experience, running these networks. A lot of the times these things go under and they end up costing the taxpayer a lot of money. And it just, these boondoggles don't always end as the proponents envision them when they start drafting. And then the final one is one that Larry Spywak over at the Phoenix Center always harps on, but I agree with, is the issue of cross subsidization, right? A lot of the times that there's a captive ratepayers on the electric side where you can basically leverage that captive rate base and charge less on the broadband side to have a competitive advantage, which is not really a fair way of looking at it, because you have a utility monopoly on the electric side and you're able to leverage those. Doesn't mean that the government has no role to play here, though, because a lot of communities, no matter how good the market is, no matter how much we lower some of these barriers to deployment, there's just not going to be a business case. And in those communities, it's important for them to work with the private industry and come up with solutions together for some kind of public-private partnerships. And maybe you can subsidize or to pay a provider to come in and connect, and you can work with them to build the network as best is going to meet the needs of that community. So there is a role to play, but I'm very cautious of these calls for municipal networks, because there's a lot of ways that they can go wrong, and a lot of ways that they can, number one, drive off investment, number two, waste taxpayer money, and exploit some of the existing consumers. So we really need to be careful and be very focused with how these local governments work with private companies to get some of these networks built out.
So Andrea, I'm going to come back to you for a minute, because Jeff's comments make me think of the challenge, at least in my experience, with dealing with policymakers in general. They are called policymakers. They're not called sit around and do nothing people. And so a lot of them want to be active. They want to do something. And you've mentioned some of this, but we heard specifically from some great Florida legislators at your event last week who really get it broadly across all kinds of technologies. But what are some suggestions of what those state legislator policymakers could be doing that's positive? We know what they shouldn't be doing, and to Florida's credit, has a real good law on the books about municipal networks. But what else could legislators be doing?
Sure. So if they have to do something and they want to have like, shovel ready, whatever, like I built this kind of a project. I mean, if they want to put money towards building kind of passive broadband infrastructure, right? Putting up the poles that different companies can lease out, digging the ditches that, need to be dug to put in the cables. These are really kind of low hanging fruit things that policymakers can do, that they can, point to their voters, say, hey, look, I put this in, that then private companies can come and lease, use, build out the infrastructure on top of that. But in terms of like probably the most important things they could be doing, looking at the policies or norms that are on the books that are preventing new build outs, right? This isn't the sexiest kind of policy, but things like who is going to bear the highest cost for using infrastructure, right? The street furniture that everyone kind of needs. What are the tax levels on that, right? Like if you tax something, you get less of it. So just making sure that the policies are as, as dedicated as possible to making it as easy to build out as possible. So in other words, to the extent that you're in the way, get out.
I like that. I think that could actually be the title of a paper directed exactly at policymakers. So, Marc, you and I have, well, let me back up a second. I never thought when I got into innovation technology that I would spend so much of my life talking about, thinking about, and explaining lumber in the form of telephone poles. And I know not all poles these days are lumber, but it's much sexier to say lumber than steel. Anyway, can you give our listeners some idea? A couple of people have mentioned it now, but some idea of the role that utility poles, play in broadband deployment, and the importance of using fair and cost-efficient access, of gaining cost-efficient access to these poles.
Yeah, no, happy to do it. I always, whenever I talk about this topic, I always worry people in the audience are now reaching for their phones to play Candy Crush and get a snack in the kitchen. But this really is one of these kind of bread and butter, nitty gritty broadband issues that really does affect broadband deployment across the country. And I think it also highlights, a place for where government does have an appropriate role to play. So it is worth a few minutes just talking about it. And just to be clear to everyone, what we're talking about here, utility poles. You look outside your house, you see a pole out there, maybe carrying electrical wires, telephone wires, and so forth. There's a reason why each company that's providing you services doesn't have its own pole. If we went down that road, people would have 20 poles out in front of their house instead of just the one. So thankfully, years ago, there's been kind of some thoughtful approach to poles. And we have a system now where, pole attachers, people like a charter who's coming to a new area to provide service, can approach a pole owner and say, I'd like to attach to your pole. And to give you some context, we're not talking about just a couple poles. When you're going into a rural area, very often you're talking for every maybe 10 homes, or for every home that you want to serve, you might have to attach to 10 poles, whereas it's quite the opposite in an urban area. So there's a lot of poles that need to get attached to when you're deploying a broadband network. What Charter has found, and other companies going into rural areas, is that getting onto these poles has been a very time-consuming and inefficient, kind of from a cost perspective, process, and it's becoming more and more expensive. And what that means is, some of you could be sitting, well, thinking that's, what's the big deal? So Charter's just going to, have to pay more to get onto a pole. But the reality is, when it is time consuming like that and costly, it produces a very inequitable result that winds up giving consumers and businesses in these communities kind of the short end of the pole, so to speak. Broadband doesn't get to their community as fast as it might have, or it's more costly to serve these areas because of this pole access issue. So, at Charter, we've noticed these increase in these costs, and we just think, it makes sense to have a fair allocation of costs between pole owners and pole attachers. We're not asking as a pole attacher to get free access to poles. Happy to pay our fair share, but too often utility pole owners have used this as an opportunity to get a brand new pole from us. We have to pay for them to get a brand new pole in order to get on their pole, which doesn't make a lot of sense, since at the end of the day, they'll own that brand new pole. So we're often talking in the states and in Congress to, change the rules or clarify the rules in such a way that makes it more cost efficient, more fair, for folks to get on these poles, because at the end result will mean we'll be able to get broadband to more places and do it in a cost-efficient way.
Very good. And so now people know why we spend a lot of time talking about timber as opposed to, I don't know, virtual reality, or whatever else. So, okay, so to everyone following along at home, we've gone federal, we've done state, we've done very local, local and then very local. I want to go back to federal just for a minute, Mike, before we turn to questions. So folks, get your questions ready, get those submitted in the Q&A. I see there's 3, I haven't looked at them yet, but thank you for those. So before we turn to the questions, let's go back to that proposed legislation just a bit more, and related to everything we've heard here. Any concerns about what might be really harmful for Congress to enact as part of the infrastructure spending bill? Or on, I guess, the flip side or the inverse, what's likely to be left out?
Well, I'll do the second part first. And what seems to be something that's still on the drawing board, if you see the versions, there's brackets around some type of broadband benefit to consumers. And I think Andrea raised this a little bit, but there's what's been referred to in DC as a permanent broadband benefit program, similar to the EBB that it operates. Should we not design something for that, some subsidy to consumer to address the affordability issue? And I say yes. I think that's important. If you design it properly, if you target it, if you address the problems up front, it can be very beneficial. People say, oh, let's just extend the Lifeline program. And I say, well, we have problems there. And that may not be the best way to go about it. So I think that's one that could be left out. That would be a mistake, and that would actually be harmful to leave that out. And I hope that will be addressed by the Congress. There are some things that I think that are being still considered that I think are problematic. I think that the role of municipal governments is certainly one of them. I think it's not being included. Things that Marc raised. I want to at least put a dollar figure for poles and attachments. I've seen a premium of 30 to 50% by new entrants just to use the same pole as an incumbent in terms of the cost. That's incredibly detrimental and discriminatory to try and actually bring service to an area. But in terms of what else is, and that's a side note, I admit. But what else is problematic? And I think that things like, a mandated low income tier or some type of rate regulation and restrictions, I think they would be very problematic. And I'd like to make sure that those were not in. And then it gets to the point I think I made in the beginning, is how much flexibility do we give to, it looks like to be NTIA in this universe, and to the state policymakers, to Andrea's point, your question to they're going to have a considerable amount of discretion in terms of the applications that they put before NTIA, in terms of what gets funded, what doesn't get funded. And I worry that they won't do the proper scrutiny. We've seen this in other examples where it's been cronyism. That's been which policymaker has a tie to particular companies in other programs that have been problematic. Dollars that are already out the door as in terms to the stimulus dollars and the CARES Act, money that's already caused problems in things like Wyoming and other places. So I'd like to believe that policymakers are going to be altruistic and always work in consumers and constituent interests. That's not always the case. And so I'd like to believe that the language will either be tightened or there'll be a deep scrutiny by Congress after the fact.
Thank you for that. That's a whole lot to think about, honestly. So let's turn to some questions and answers. And we've got some really good questions, and some of them a bit long and a bit involved. So I'm going to throw this to everybody, anyone who wants a piece of this. So the first question is from Robert Hyde. He asked, this particular issue, possibly similar to the rural electrification efforts during the 1930s and beyond, is this an appropriate characterization? And do you envision an ongoing national broadband option similar to what currently public television represents? Perhaps this communication technology might provide an appropriate Wi-Fi internet connection alternative for the general public. A couple different angles here. Who would like to jump in? If not, I'll call on someone.
I'll jump in and let the experts respond afterwards. In terms of a national broadband public television form, I don't see that developing. Yes, Wi-Fi is incredibly important. I'm a strong supporter, but I don't believe that we're going to build a public television for broadband. I'd like to believe that municipal governments aren't going to be involved, and I certainly don't believe we're going to have a national broadband network, a nationalization. I think that's in terms of the REA and the work that it did in electrification. You know, people always highlight and say, "Oh, this is just like then." And it'd be one thing if that were the case, and we had all the advantages of the circumstance, and the things that Marc has raised and Jeff has raised, and Andrea to some degree, if it had all the right to basically plow ahead and do anything it wants and not have to worry about, you know, the restrictions and the environmental concerns about building, if there were no barriers to do things, that'd be one comparison. But these are apples and oranges in terms of electrification and broadband in my mind.
So one thing I'll point out, I mean, when I saw this question, I just thought specifically about the Biden administration's kind of marketing of the infrastructure bill, of which 100 billion is earmarked for broadband. And they do use that language of this is the electrification for our time. And I think that conjures kind of a romantic view of this. I mean, the Great Depression and kind of the patriotic programs that came out of that. But as our conversations kind of attest, this is like a technical problem, right? We're solving like a couple of, you know, the last percentage of people that are perhaps the hardest to reach. And I worry that kind of marketing might maybe oversell the policies that are being offered. And this is something that we need to approach carefully and not romantically, like some of the press releases have.
Good, Marc.
Yeah, no, I guess I agree with what everybody's already said, and maybe it's a little off topic, but I do often worry about these comparisons, obviously with broadband, electrification, and broadband kind of being thrown in with infrastructure like it's a broken down, you know, road or bridge, or, you know, it's just not the case with broadband. You know, broadband is a to put it out there, I think Jeff maybe mentioned this. This is not like flipping a switch and you're all set and ready to go. I mean, broadband networks require a lot of technical expertise, a lot of investment, you know, each and every year. And you know, to the point I just made about it's not like a broken down bridge. Our networks are doing great. You know, during the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of concern that broadband wasn't going to be up to the task, and it really was up to the task. So, but that's not to say that there aren't still gaps that we've all been talking about that need to be closed, and we see a targeted role for government to play. But to kind of lump broadband in with some other categories, it makes me a bit nervous.
Yeah, I've often thought that the better analogy was to a telephone, and at the peak telephone. So think of the phone hanging on your wall or sitting on your desk, not today. So I'm not going to remember the year exactly, but let's say by the year 2000, I'll just pick a day. The best penetration rate that we got in this country for telephones, depending on which study you looked at, was between 94 and 95%. Well, that's pretty darn close to the broadband number. In fact, you can argue that we actually have better broadband penetration than that. And yet we didn't do a big program to get a telephone hung on every wall in every kitchen across America. So I think that's the better analogy than electrification, honestly. But Jeff, I think you maybe had something to jump in here.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Marc at the end there, but even kind of the comparison to telephone isn't really a great one, because with telephone, it's voice calls. Obviously, you want to build reliability, you want to make the quality, you know, good of these voice calls, but at the end of the day, the quality isn't, all that important. We're investing billions into broadband networks because the differences between networks is stark sometimes. I play a lot of Call of Duty Warzone, and if I'm on one provider, I was on a provider and I was having a lot of latency, even though I had plenty of download speed. Just the network design, the way they were routing traffic wasn't necessarily going through as efficiently as it could. I switched providers, had a better network design, and I was able to, reduce my latency issues. And the point I'm trying to make, kind of tangentially, is to say that these networks aren't like telephone. It's not just like I just need the phone call to work. You want these networks to constantly be improving, constantly be developing in ways that are going to offer new capabilities to consumers. So it's a very, dynamic market where you want a lot of this investment going in to constantly improve the quality of these networks and see the differences between the networks. And it's a different product than something as kind of static as a voice call or electricity generally. So I just want to make that kind of point too.
Like everything you said, except the first thing where you criticized my analogy. We won't be calling on you anymore. Okay, so with Jeff speaking, this is from Eric Peterson, with Jeff speaking about WISPs and their need for spectrum, this comes to you, Mike. I want to ask Commissioner O'Rielly, what do you think of the future of spectrum policy is at the FCC? Will the current FCC continue to open up spectrum like you did, or will the FCC pivot to something that won't close the digital divide like net neutrality?
Well, look at I had benefited and enjoyed my time at the commission and pushing for the commercialization and more opportunity for spectrum bands. But I would say that going forward, there's some difficult challenges to find new bands for these purposes. They're not easy, and I do think that the commission risks being sidetracked by other issues that I think are irrelevant in the time and circumstance we live in. I think net neutrality is a great example. The commission will spend a great deal of time and energy on net neutrality. And it really won't have much of an impact. They'll make people feel better about themselves in a select group, but it won't actually provide, improve the circumstances. I think spectrum policy really would, but there are some really hard choices to be had, and it requires, in-depth, time-consuming work, and it also requires, a partner on the other side from the federal government, and a willingness to acknowledge that we're going to need more commercial spectrum, and it's a heavy charge, and I hope this commission is up to it.
Thank you, Mike. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I'll just say that, spectrum policy is definitely something that is a challenge, but it's also critical, and just kind of repeating what Mike was talking about, but, really struggling right now to free up additional spectrum, especially the spectrum owned by the federal government, and kind of easing those processes is something I'm really interested in researching a little bit more and finding ways to kind of ease those tensions. And it's something I think the FCC should be focused on. And the more we kind of derail these conversations, the harder it can be to solve some of these really tough questions, because it's not easy, right? Like a lot of these problems are really difficult to solve, and it's not necessarily something that's an easy win for the commission. So maybe we'll focus on something a little more in the news. But I think solving some of these spectrum challenges is going to be critical, not just for the next 5-10 years, but for the next 30, 40, 50. And it's something I think they should definitely continue to prioritize like the previous commission did.
And Bartlett, could I just jump in to comment on top of my answer and say, I hope that this commission doesn't revisit a lot of the things we've already decided. If it has to go back and undo, I think that's very problematic. And I'm not advocating or involved in any proceedings of the commission, but I'd like, I've got an op-ed on this that I'm working on. I'd like to believe that those decisions have been made, you like them or not, but we've got to move on and move forward and try and tackle the new rather than redigging the old.
Combining your guys' comments, let me just say it's really great thoughts, because it is not cool to have to do the kind of scut work, right? To your point, Jeff, it's hard work. Mike, you've been there, you've done it. And you don't get all the accolades of kind of the sexy showboating stuff that you could be doing. And yet it's so critical for the future, which goes right into, Mike, what you said, which is we've got to be thinking about the future. I mean, the future, but by definition, when we're thinking the future, we're thinking of innovation. And when we're looking at the past, we're just retreading history, and nothing is accomplished at the end of the day. Maybe political goals, maybe some of that sexy headline grabbing stuff, but nothing really for the American people. So I'd love the combination of your thoughts. Marc, did I hear you jumping in?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna, echo the things that people were saying, and in particular, Commissioner O'Reilly and former Chairman Pai were very careful in their thinking of balancing licensed and unlicensed spectrum. And, I hope that continues, and we could have a whole panel on that. But the general gist there is that there are, complicated, balancing that you have to do with spectrum. It's already been done, and why go back and revisit that? And I'm hopeful that this current commission will not do that.
Absolutely. So Tom, I know you wanted to jump in with a question / observations. Are you able to do that?
Yes, thank you, Bartlett. We have a lot of other questions we want to get to too, so I don't want to take their time, but I just wanted to make the observation that I've been monitoring my own bandwidth usage during this event as we have been doing this event. So I'm sitting here hosting a fairly complicated technological video conferencing thing here, the kind of thing that 10 years ago, we would have thought was really cutting edge. At no time has this required more than 1.4 megabits per second to do. So when I hear people talking about you don't have broadband unless you've got 100 up, 100 down, it really makes me suspect they have a different agenda other than bridging the digital divide. It seems to me that they're trying to remake an industry the way they think it ought to be done. And so I wanted to share that, what I thought was an interesting statistical observation on the bandwidth usage, and then invite folks to comment on whether or not there's actually another agenda at work here by some folks in the Biden administration who are putting these programs together.
Any comment?
Look, I appreciate your acknowledgement, Tom, of the speeds. I've been debating them out for quite a long time. I don't always win. They aren't really, you can't convince people of that, even if you've got the facts on your side. And I think of the comment that Marc raised in terms of the new network they're building, a gig down and half a gig for up. What a wonderful opportunity. And there are advocates who say, well, that's not symmetrical. That shouldn't qualify. I mean, and that is just mind blowing given how advanced and the work and the investment that the Charter is doing and other companies are doing on the legacy side. And you see what the new entrants are doing that Jeff has talked about before. So you can't necessarily win this argument on facts, but because the advocates are just so committed to their cause.
Thanks for that. All right, I'm going to combine two questions together. Andrea, this one specifically was asked to you, but I'm going to add a little bit to it. And if you want to pass on that to the rest of the group, great. But the first is from Eric Peterson. The piece I'm adding in is from an anonymous attendee. The question to you, Andrea, is how could a consumer voucher be used with technologies like low Earth orbit satellites to increase adoption in rural areas? I'm going to combine that with this question about how functional is satellite as a solution for rural broadband in some kind of realistic time frame. So consumer vouchers, other technologies, specifically calling out low Earth orbit satellites, and then more broadly with satellite as a solution.
Sure. So first of all, thanks to Eric for politely reminding me that I didn't talk specifically about technology neutrality, but he raises an excellent point. So when we're talking about things like consumer vouchers, one of the nice things about it, and one of the reasons that it's so incentive compatible, is that it doesn't prioritize any particular company or any particular technology. So a lot of our conversation so far has been about, I guess you could say, terrestrial connection, right? Terrestrial broadband, but low Earth satellites, the kind of name brand is Starlink. These new developments are fastly becoming maybe not a total solution, but certainly a very good alternative. In fact, my brother-in-law recently moved out to the country, and even though they do have access to kind of traditional internet out there, he's looking at Starlink for, it's going to be very fast and very affordable for his own purposes. So yes, I think it is a solution. The way that kind of, I guess, consumer vouchers would play there is, so to get a Starlink connection, you first need to purchase some equipment, and then you pay like a monthly fee, like, you know, most internet connections. So yeah, having that voucher could cover perhaps some of the initial investment in the hardware and the equipment, and also maybe subsidize your monthly rate. So that's actually a really great example of how consumer vouchers can spur access right now, even without the kind of build outs that we've been talking. Of course, things like Starlink, and there are competitors, they're not available everywhere right now. So that's one limitation. Another limitation is there's kind of some conversations around spectrum management and how Starlink is going to use that and how that might impede on other uses. So that's certainly something that's still being hashed out. But in terms of the second question, it's definitely a great option. And this is exactly the kind of innovation that we've all been talking about today. In terms of a time frame, so I'm not an expert in like satellite internet, so I don't know what the projections are. Maybe somebody else on the panel has an idea, but again, this is exactly the kind of innovation that our policies need to account for. And if we have things like municipal owned networks, if we have things like this is the definition for broadband that you must meet, we're gonna, totally exclude these kind of new and exciting things.
Anyone else want to jump in with anything? By the way, we still have a ton more questions, but if anyone else wants to jump in, go ahead.
Look, satellite's a wonderful opportunity. I've been fans and talked about Starlink, but I also talked about where, Amazon's got a new project in this one. They're going to spend an inordinate amount of money to bring satellite service to Americans. Wonderful opportunities. And with all the different existing technologies, what a time to be alive for a broadband user. Yeah,
totally agree. So Ken Pyle has, I think, a really great question, and I don't have any idea of the answer. So he says, or he asks, we always think of Lifeline services in terms of dollars, for example, $10 for Internet Essentials. Is anyone considering a walled garden type Lifeline program, for example, access to school, government services, et cetera? Anyone know? I'm going to tip my hat to Ken Pyle for stumping the panel. Way to go, Ken. You can collect your reward of 52 cents from Tom Giovanetti. That's great. Well, if you guys think of anything while this is going, let me know. I don't have an answer either.
I would only say that there are a number of wireless providers who have thought about serving schools and the children that attend, and they've run into some other issues, as you can imagine, by that population, of some privacy issues and things of that nature. So the business model has been kind of difficult, even though we talked about a walled garden, so you'd have a protected universe. It has, not, the marketplace hasn't exactly been favorable so far.
And I guess, just a couple things that I would mention. I mean, certainly during, the COVID pandemic and, a lot of ISPs, thanks, to the leadership of Commissioner O'Reilly and Chairman Pai at the FCC, kind of worked to make sure folks were connected for school and online learning. Lots of providers participate in the E-rate program with schools to keep them connected. I think our philosophy, certainly at Charter, we have a product that is devoted to folks, low-income families. We just don't think of kind of limiting that product to only, one particular use. We want people, if you qualify, to kind of come and take advantage of that product.
Yeah, and just to build off that, I just don't see the logic of really limiting the use of this technology. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I get the concern that maybe we're subsidizing people to use this to go watch Netflix or whatever, and like that's not how the money should be spent. But just it doesn't make sense to me to limit the technology to a couple specific apps, because there's so much promise of the internet. I'm a tech optimist. I love technology. I think there's so much cool stuff out there. It just seems like a waste of money to subsidize connection and maybe a device, depending on what we're talking about, and then say, well, you can only use this for Gmail and for the home school homework app or whatever that they're using. It just there's so much interesting stuff on the internet that obviously there's some bad places, but to limit the just wealth of knowledge just seems like a bad idea to me.
All right, here's a great question, because we didn't talk much about directly about small cells as we were rolling through our stuff here. So the question is broad and to anybody. What is your assessment of the overall progress of small cells in the US? And as I ask that question, how about whoever answers first, give us a quick definition of what small cells are. Anyone?
Well, yeah, I guess I could start us off and just say small cells are, you know, when we're moving to 5G networks, we need to densify the network. So basically what that means is we're putting smaller towers up, basically. I mean, they're not towers, but the traditional language was always the size of a pizza box, but I think that the language has changed a little bit, but they're just basically small radios that they're putting up a lot more of them. So when we talk about a lot of the infrastructure reforms, a lot of that was due to the fact that they're designed for the old macro cell towers that you traditionally think of when you think of a cell tower. And now we're trying to put up these smaller antennas up around in a lot more dense areas. And I think the work that the commission's been doing, especially, but a lot of state governments as well, have really streamlined that process and made it a lot easier for these cells for these providers to go deploy small cells into a lot of different networks. We've seen a lot of the 5G services starting to get deployed, and you know, I'm really excited to see where things are going. And you know, it's important that we kind of keep moving forward on a lot of these infrastructure reforms. The commission's done great work, like I said, but there's still more work for state governments to do, and the federal legislature could always go ahead and enshrine some of this stuff in law. Obviously, regulations aren't as solid, I guess, as actual law, so that could be another avenue, and perhaps even tying some of the subsidy funding towards local governments adopting some of these streamlined process to make it easier to deploy could be something to consider as well.
Mike, you had a great perspective, I would think, on this, given your perch.
Well, I would say, you know, to not to be pithy, but I think the answer is that it's smaller than most people would have expected. You know, it is an important evolution of wireless technology, and I'm a big fan. Worked hard to make sure we got the barriers as best we could out of the way to deploy small cell networks, whether they be on the state and local governments or on the, you know, things in multiple layers on the federal government agencies. But the truth is, they probably haven't been as, you know, macro towers have been as important for the next technology and deployment of 5G, and as we head to 6G, then small cells have been in certain areas and certain technologies. If you're talking millimeter wave, they've definitely, you know, been. But I think that the early estimations of growth have been smaller than expected, and that will change over time, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with what we've done or where we are. It's just been a little bit slower. You also have, you know, economic recession. You have a pandemic, and you've got, you know, companies that had to make sure that they were operating with all of the capacity at the time that they had. So networks are being deployed, and small cells are certainly going to be part of that going forward.
So with one eye on the time, I know there are more questions. We're just which is awesome, and I thank everyone that submitted questions, and I wish we could get to all of them. I'm going to have everybody here as we wrap up give how they can be contacted, and then IPI will give coordinates how we can be contacted, so we can answer all those questions. You just might have to send them additionally somewhere in addition to this, but it's so cool we had so much engagement. So with that, let me give each of you, you know, no more than 60 seconds. Is there anything you want to say to wrap up?
Well, I guess I'll start. I won't take 60 seconds. I'll be pithy as I can. Thank you to IPI for organizing and operating this great forum. And I really appreciate the in-depth conversation about a really important topic that Congress is debating right at this exact moment. And I like to believe that we're heading in the right direction based on some of the comments and thoughts that you all have had over the many years, and not just today, that have really influenced the debate, not only in my private sector days, but also when I was at the commission. And I really appreciate that. And I'm available to answer any questions after the fact if people need.
Thank you. I'll just call on people. Marc, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you to IPI, and this has been a great conversation. I'll just kind of end where I started, which is hopefully folks listening, you know, get the sense of, you know, targeted government solutions really are the best way to go, and ones that really have real defined goals and that don't ignore the success and the investment that's already been made, especially when we're using taxpayer dollars, it makes a lot of sense to be very thoughtful and targeted about the government's role in broadband.
Absolutely. Andrea?
Sure. Yeah. So thanks for having me here. This was a great conversation. I guess my closing message is just that state and local policymakers have a lot they can do in terms of broadband access and deployment. If anyone is interested in some of the research that I mentioned today, you can go to jamesmadison.org. We have actually a paper by Bartlett talking about bridging the gap in Florida. And then the recent paper on consumer vouchers that is still forthcoming. So if you're interested in getting an early copy, just shoot me an email, Andrea@jamesmadison.org.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, just thank you for having me. And, I think the closing thing for me is just to reemphasize the fact that we want to promote investment and innovation. So the best way to do that is a market-driven approach. And you can find a lot of our work at ourstreet.org, or you can find me on Twitter at Jeffrey Westling. I'm normally on there yelling about the sun, so deal with that as it were. But always happy to chat and talk about some of our work. Our big broadband scorecard talks a lot about some of these infrastructure things like pole attachments and access to rights of way and zoning reviews and stuff like that. So that's something we care a lot about.
And Mike, I forgot to have you say, what's the best way to find your work or to get hold of you?
Yes, a simple email will be great. It's MikeO'Reilly1@gmail.com. That's my simple business line, and it's working perfect.
Good deal. And Mark, best information, is that up on charter communications something or spectrum something?
Yeah, no, exactly. Best way to get a hold of me, mark.paul@charter.com.
Very good. So before I turn it back to Tom, and you can reach me at bcleland@ipi.org. Tom can give you some of the stuff about IPI generally, but Andrea, thank you for your intellectual leadership in Florida. It's clearly making a difference. Mark, as always, there is never a day that I don't wish I could spend more time talking about telephone poles. So any day I get to talk about poles with you is a great day. Mike, your girls are raising you quite well. And so don't fear, they're doing a good job. And Jeff, I hope you're not too depressed. I hope this discussion of broadband was a little bit uplifting, and know that next year you'll get to watch a more high def, faster delivered to you basketball tournament that hopefully will feature the Suns. With that, I'm Bart Cleland. Tom, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Bartlett. I just want to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy day to spend an hour and 15 minutes with us here at IPI on this important topic. Really appreciate it. Bartlett, I appreciate you doing all the work on this particular event so I could just sit back and watch. It's a rarity for me. So I thoroughly enjoyed being able to just sit back and watch someone else carry the load. As I mentioned earlier, this event will be recorded and archived on our IPI website, and it'll be on our YouTube channel, so you can share it with other people who you think might benefit from it. We're getting close to 30 similar events that we've done since the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and all of those events are archived on our website and on our YouTube channel. And we're very thankful to the folks at Zoom for making this technology possible so that think tanks and policy groups could continue to do their job and continue to do their work, even when we couldn't gather together in person. So thanks again, everyone. We really appreciate it. It was a great event, great content. Thanks for all of our attendees and all of our supporters. And with that, we will bid you adieu and wish you a good rest of your afternoon. Thank you.